1975, 7 men sat down together at one table in New York City. Not to negotiate a truce, not to divide territory at gunpoint, not because anyone forced them to. They sat down because one man, one extraordinarily dangerous, extraordinarily brilliant man, had looked at the chaos around him and seen something nobody else had the vision to see. He saw waste. He saw 7 separate kingdoms bleeding each other dry when they could have been building an empire together. So he called a meeting. And at that meeting, they did something that had never been done before in the history of American organized crime at that level. They wrote rules. They created a structure. They established a board of directors with votes and procedures and collective decision-making. They built something that functioned less like a street gang and more like a Fortune 500 company. Except the product was heroin and the market was Harlem, and the cost was paid in human lives across an entire generation. 7 men, one table, one set of rules that every member swore to follow. And at the peak of their power, those 7 men controlled an estimated $100 million a year in heroin distribution across New York City. The DA knew they existed. Law enforcement knew their names. And for years, nobody could touch them. Because the organization they built was airtight. The loyalty was real. The discipline was enforced. And the man who designed it had studied the most sophisticated criminal organization America had ever produced, the Italian Mafia, and had decided he could do it better. His name was Leroy Barnes. But nobody called him Leroy. The streets called him Nicky. The New York Times called him something else entirely. Something that would end up on a magazine cover that changed his life forever, set the entire federal government against him, and began the chain of events that would bring everything crashing down. They called him Mr. Untouchable. And for a while, for one extraordinary, terrifying, devastating while, that name was completely accurate. This is the story that no movie finished. This is the story that no documentary told completely. This is the full, factual, deeply researched account of the council, who built it, how it worked, why it was unprecedented, and the exact chain of events that destroyed it from the inside out. Not from the outside, from the inside, because the DEA didn't bring down the council. Betrayal did. And the betrayal came from the last person anyone expected. Before we go any further, drop in the comments right now and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who's staying up late for this one, because I know some of you are. This is that kind of story. And if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe right now. This is where the real stories live. Not the Hollywood version. Not the legend. The actual truth, with court records and primary sources and the names of real people whose lives were changed forever. That is what we do here. Every single time. And one more thing before we start. If this video teaches you something tonight that no documentary, no film, no other video ever told you, hit that like button and share it with someone who thinks they already know this story. Let's go. To understand what the council was, you first have to understand the world that made it not just possible but inevitable. You have to stand in Harlem in 1972 and look around and see what was actually there. Not the myth, not the nostalgia, not the romanticized version that gets filtered through music and movies, but the actual physical and social reality of one of the most consequential neighborhoods in American history at one of the most consequential moments in American history. Because the council didn't appear out of nowhere. It was grown in specific soil. And that soil was a combination of poverty and opportunity and abandonment and rage and a vacuum of power so vast that someone was always going to fill it. The only question was who. Harlem in the early 1970s was a neighborhood in the process of being erased. Not literally demolished, not yet, though that would come too, but socially and economically gutted in a way that left the physical buildings standing while emptying them of everything that had once made them worth living in. The great wave of white flight that had started in the 1950s had accelerated through the 1960s, taking tax revenue and investment and political attention with it. Federal housing policy had concentrated poverty in specific zip codes with the efficiency of a military operation, stacking the most vulnerable families in high-rise towers that were already deteriorating before the last tenant moved in. Jobs had evaporated. The manufacturing economy that had given unskilled workers a path to stability, the docks, the garment district, the factories, was collapsing under the pressure of automation and deindustrialization. And the safety net that was supposed to catch people when those jobs disappeared was being systematically defunded by a combination of Nixon-era political hostility and the simple mathematical reality that there was never enough money to do what actually needed to be done. The civil rights movement had won legal battles that mattered enormously: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the dismantling of formal legal segregation, but legal equality had not translated into economic equality anywhere near fast enough for the people living through it. The promised land that Martin Luther King had spoken about from mountaintops was nowhere visible from street level in Harlem in 1972. What was visible was broken glass and boarded windows and children playing in hallways because the streets weren't safe and the parks were controlled by people who weren't interested in children playing. What was visible was the particular combination of boredom and desperation that comes from having nothing to do and nowhere to go and no reason to believe that tomorrow will be different from today. And into that vacuum, into that specific, documented, historically verifiable vacuum came heroin. Not for the first time. Heroin had been in black communities since the 1950s, when it flooded in through distribution networks controlled entirely by the Italian mob, specifically the Five Families of New York. The mob had recognized the profitability of the heroin trade early and had built the import infrastructure, the relationships with foreign suppliers, the smuggling routes, the wholesale distribution networks, while carefully keeping actual street-level dealing at arm's length, using black and Puerto Rican middlemen as a buffer between the mob's upper structure and the criminal liability of retail drug sales. It was a brilliant arrangement for the Italians. They made the majority of the money while bearing the minority of the legal risk. The people who actually touched the product and the customers, the people most likely to get arrested and prosecuted, were not Italian, and therefore their arrests didn't threaten the core organization. But by the late 1960s, that arrangement was beginning to fracture. And it was fracturing for a specific, documentable reason that had everything to do with the changing internal dynamics of the Italian mob itself. The old generation of mob leadership, the men who had built the heroin trade and understood it as a business, was dying or going to prison. The new generation coming up was more volatile, more internally conflicted, and operating under increasing law enforcement pressure that made the careful, insulated operation of a heroin distribution empire more difficult than it had been in the 1950s. The mob was contracting, not expanding. And as it contracted, it began to pull back from the heroin trade specifically, partly because of law enforcement pressure, partly because of internal disagreement about the risks, and partly because the trade was becoming more trouble than it was worth when they had other revenue streams to protect. That contraction created something that had never existed before in the New York drug economy. It created a gap at the wholesale level, a gap in the heroin supply chain that the Italian mob had previously owned completely. And into that gap stepped a generation of black entrepreneurs who had been watching the mob operate for decades and had learned, carefully and completely, exactly how it worked. They had the street infrastructure. They had the customer relationships. They had the capital accumulated through years of retail dealing. And now, for the first time, they had the opportunity to control their own supply, to go directly to the sources the mob had been going to, cut out the middleman, and capture the full margin of the trade rather than the thin slice the Italians had been willing to leave them. The supply lines that opened up ran primarily through Southeast Asia and through what was called the French Connection, the Marseilles-based heroin networks that had supplied American cities for decades. But new routes were also opening through Southeast Asia as the Vietnam War created both supply and demand simultaneously. American soldiers coming home with heroin habits, and entrepreneurs in the region recognizing the export opportunity. The specific operators who made these connections on behalf of the new generation of black drug lords in Harlem are documented in DEA files and court records, and they represent one of the most significant structural shifts in American drug distribution history. For the first time, black operators controlled not just retail and wholesale but the import supply chain itself. The vertical integration that had made the Italian mob so powerful and so profitable was now available to a new set of players. The neighborhood those players operated in was Harlem, and the specific geography of their operations mattered enormously. Harlem in the early 1970s was a collection of distinct territories, each controlled by different operators, each with its own customer base and street infrastructure and set of relationships with local law enforcement. Some of those relationships purely adversarial, others considerably more complicated. The specific territories that would eventually come together to form the council's domain ran from roughly 110th Street to 155th Street, encompassing some of the densest and most economically devastated real estate in the country. Within that geography, the heroin trade was not just a business. It was one of the primary economic institutions of the neighborhood. In communities where legitimate employment was scarce and the social infrastructure had been systematically defunded, the drug trade provided income, structure, status, and a version of upward mobility that the legitimate economy had made impossible for most of the people who lived there. The specific individuals who were rising to prominence in this world by the early 1970s would eventually sit at a single table together. But before that table existed, they were competitors, sometimes violently so. Territory disputes in the heroin trade were not settled by lawyers and arbitration. They were settled by violence, and the violence in Harlem in this period was staggering in its scale and its costs. People died over blocks. People died over corners. People died because someone looked at someone wrong, or because a deal went sideways, or because one operator decided that the fastest way to expand his territory was to eliminate the person who was currently occupying it. The human cost of that competition, even before you account for the human cost of the heroin itself, was enormous. The man who looked at that violence and that waste and that chaos and decided to end it by replacing competition with cooperation was already, by the early 1970s, the most respected and the most feared drug operator in Harlem. He had spent years in prison learning things that would make him more dangerous when he got out than he had ever been going in. He had studied the Italians carefully and adopted the parts of their model that he believed were transferable. He had survived things that should have killed him and legal proceedings that should have convicted him, and emerged from each with his reputation enhanced. He was not the biggest operator in Harlem in terms of raw volume, not yet. But he was the smartest. And in a world where smart eventually beats big, that distinction mattered. His name was Leroy Barnes, and the meeting he called in 1975 would create something that American law enforcement had never seen before and has never quite seen since. 7 men. 1 table, 1 set of rules, and the most sophisticated black criminal organization in American history, built on a foundation of heroin, held together by loyalty and mutual self-interest, and ultimately destroyed by the one human force that no organizational structure can fully contain: betrayal. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get to the fall, we have to understand exactly what was built. And to understand what was built, we have to understand the man who built it. Leroy Nicholas Barnes was born on October 15, 1933 in Harlem, New York, and the Harlem he was born into was a different place than the Harlem of the 1970s, though the differences were perhaps not as large as people later liked to believe. The neighborhood had been the cultural capital of Black America for decades by the time Barnes arrived. The Harlem Renaissance was already 20 years in the past, but still alive in the consciousness of the community, in the jazz clubs and the churches and the specific texture of a neighborhood that knew it was something, even when the rest of the country was determined to remind it that it was nothing. Barnes grew up in this world and was shaped by it in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. He was intelligent, genuinely, unusually intelligent, in a neighborhood and a time when intelligence in a young black man had very few legitimate outlets. His childhood was marked by the specific hardships of Depression-era and wartime Harlem, poverty that was structural rather than circumstantial, meaning it wasn't going to go away when times got better because it was woven into the economic architecture of the neighborhood itself. His family, like most families in the blocks where he grew up, lived on the margin of everything. Margin of stability, margin of comfort, margin of the kind of security that most Americans took for granted. And the young Leroy Barnes observed this with the eyes of someone who was already, even as a child, performing a continuous cost-benefit analysis on the world around him. He saw what legitimate work looked like in his neighborhood, the specific jobs available to black men in 1940s Harlem, the specific wages those jobs paid, the specific ceiling above which no amount of effort and talent could lift you if you were the wrong color in the wrong zip code. And he saw what the alternative looked like. The men who had money, the men who had respect, the men who moved through the neighborhood with a different posture than the men who went to work every morning and came home with nothing. His first arrests came in his late teens and early 20s, minor drug charges initially, the kind of charges that were almost inevitable for a young man in his circumstances who had decided that the legitimate economy was not offering him anything worth pursuing. But even at this early stage, Barnes was different from his peers in one critical way. He paid attention. He watched everything and everyone around him with a precision that most people reserve for subjects they love. And what Barnes loved, the thing that genuinely engaged his full intellectual capacity, was the mechanics of organization. How things worked, how power was distributed, how decisions got made, how some men managed to insulate themselves from consequence while others absorbed all the risk. These were not abstract questions for him. They were practical problems with practical solutions, and he intended to find them. His early prison time, and there was early prison time, multiple short stints for drug-related offenses through the late 1950s and early 1960s, gave him something that the streets alone could not. It gave him time to think. Sustained, uninterrupted time in the company of men who had tried various approaches to the same fundamental problem he was working on and had failed in various instructive ways. Prison, for Barnes, was less a punishment than a graduate seminar in organizational failure, a continuous study in what not to do and why, conducted by professors who had paid for their knowledge with years of their lives. He was a meticulous student. He listened more than he talked. He observed more than he participated. And he came away from each stint with a clearer, more refined model of what success in his chosen field actually required. But the education that truly transformed Nicky Barnes came from a source that most people in his position never had access to. It came from the Italians. Specifically, it came from his connection to the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 families that had controlled organized crime in New York for decades, and from a particular relationship with a Lucchese associate named Matthew Madonna who would serve as something like a mentor to the young Barnes in the late 1960s. The exact nature of this relationship and what Barnes extracted from it is documented in DEA reports and court records, and what emerges from those documents is a portrait of a man who was doing something extraordinarily deliberate. He was not simply working with the Italians as a business partner in the heroin trade, though he was certainly doing that too. He was studying them. He was examining the organizational principles that had allowed the Italian mob to maintain coherent criminal enterprises across generations, the specific structures, the specific rules, the specific mechanisms of accountability and enforcement, and he was reverse engineering them for a different context. What he found when he looked at the mob's organizational model was both inspiring and instructive in ways that went beyond the obvious. The Italian mob had survived for generations not because of violence. Violence was easy, anyone could do violence, but because of structure, because of rules that everyone understood and everyone followed and everyone enforced on each other. Because of a system where individual ambition was channeled into collective benefit rather than allowed to tear the organization apart. Because of a clear hierarchy where decisions had a process and disputes had a resolution mechanism and loyalty was not just expected but systematically incentivized. Barnes studied all of this. He absorbed it. And he began to understand that the reason black criminal organizations in Harlem had never achieved anything like the mob's longevity and stability was not because of any inherent difference in the people involved. It was because of the absence of exactly this kind of structure. By the late 1960s, Barnes had built a substantial heroin operation in Harlem through a combination of organizational brilliance, physical fearlessness, and a reputation for absolute reliability in his business dealings. A reputation that was, in the drug trade, worth more than almost anything else. He paid debts. He honored agreements. He delivered what he said he would deliver when he said he would deliver it. In a world defined by uncertainty and broken commitments, these qualities made him someone that serious people wanted to do business with. And serious people, including serious people on the supply side of the heroin trade, began to seek him out rather than the other way around. His operation grew. His territory expanded. His income reached levels that required sophisticated management just to conceal and deploy effectively. But it was his legal escapes that truly cemented his legend. Barnes had a relationship with the legal system that seemed to operate by different rules than the ones that governed everyone else's relationship with it. He was arrested. He was prosecuted. And repeatedly, impossibly, he walked away. The most spectacular of these legal disappearing acts came in a major narcotics case in the mid-1970s where prosecutors believed they had assembled an overwhelming case, the kind of case that should have been a straightforward conviction. Barnes hired the best legal team money could buy, and his defense was meticulous and aggressive. The case collapsed. The jury acquitted. The allegations of jury tampering that followed, allegations that were investigated but never conclusively proven in criminal proceedings, became part of the Barnes mythology. Whether through legal brilliance, jury corruption, witness intimidation, or some combination of all three, Nicky Barnes had walked away from what should have been a career-ending prosecution, and the story spread through Harlem with the speed and distortion of any legend that serves a community's need for a certain kind of hero. The law enforcement community's response to these acquittals was fury, specifically the kind of institutional fury that gets translated into resources and priority. The DEA, the NYPD, and the federal prosecutor's office in the Southern District of New York had each, at various points, made Barnes a priority target and watched him walk away. Each failure sharpened their understanding of what they were dealing with. This was not a standard drug operator. This was someone who understood how the legal system worked and was exploiting that understanding systematically. Taking him down was going to require a different approach, something more sophisticated, something that couldn't be defeated by a skilled defense team and a compromised witness. They would spend years finding that approach. In the meantime, Barnes operated. And then came the magazine. The New York Times Magazine cover from January 1977. The photograph of Nicky Barnes in his fur coat and his oversized tinted glasses, staring directly into the camera with an expression that contained equal parts contempt, amusement, and absolute confidence in his own invincibility, was not an accident. Barnes had agreed to the interview and the photo shoot deliberately, with full understanding of what the image would communicate. He wanted it. He wanted the recognition. He wanted the world to know that he existed, that he was untouchable, that the system that was supposed to contain men like him had failed completely, and he was the proof. The headline that the Times put on the cover, Mr. Untouchable, was not something anyone applied to him from the outside. It was something he had been calling himself for years. The magazine just gave it a wider audience. The philosophy that Barnes operated from, the worldview that animated everything he did and everything he built, was one of the most unusual things about him when you examine it closely. He did not see himself as a criminal in any simple sense. He saw himself as an entrepreneur operating in the only market that his background, his race, and his historical moment had left fully open to him. He had looked at the legitimate economy and calculated, with complete accuracy, that it offered him nothing, no path to the kind of wealth and power and respect that he believed he was capable of achieving. And so he had turned to the illegitimate economy with the same rational, systematic approach that a business school graduate might bring to a career in finance or technology. The moral dimension, the heroin, the addiction, the human destruction, was something he either genuinely failed to fully reckon with or chose not to reckon with, and in his own later accounts, he gives both explanations at different times in ways that suggest the truth is somewhere more complicated than either. What is unambiguous is this: by the mid-1970s, Nicky Barnes was the most powerful independent drug operator in New York City, possibly in the country. He had connections to supply chains that no one else in his position had. He had accumulated capital that was staggering in its scale. He had survived legal proceedings that should have destroyed him. He had studied organizational theory, informal, empirical organizational theory, more carefully than most people study anything. And he had arrived at a conclusion that would change American criminal history. He looked around at the other operators in Harlem, the men who controlled their own territories, who had their own supply relationships, who were competing with each other in ways that were costing all of them money and lives, and he did not see enemies. He saw waste. He saw potential. He saw what 7 separate companies with redundant costs and destructive competition between them could become if they merged into one coherent enterprise. He saw, in the chaos of the Harlem drug trade, the outline of something that had never existed before, and he decided he was going to build it. The council, at its founding, consisted of 7 men. 7 men who had each, independently, built something substantial: territories, supply chains, street organizations, capital reserves, and who were each, independently, leaving enormous value on the table because of the conflict and competition between them. Understanding what the council was requires understanding who these 7 men actually were as individuals, because the organization was not an abstraction. It was a specific group of specific people with specific histories and specific psychologies, and the way it functioned, and ultimately the way it failed, cannot be understood without that specificity. Nicky Barnes held the position of what you might call chairman. Though the council structure was formally egalitarian, every member had 1 vote, and major decisions required unanimous agreement. But Barnes was the architect, the visionary, the man whose intelligence and reputation and organizational authority made the whole thing function. He was the reason the other 6 sat down. He was the reason they stayed. He was, in almost every practical sense, the irreplaceable element of the enterprise. His specific role within the council was to manage the overall supply chain, the connections to wholesale heroin sources that he had developed through his relationship with the Lucchese family and through his own direct connections to importers. He was also the primary interface with the external world, with lawyers, with corrupt officials, with the Italian suppliers who respected him in a way they did not necessarily respect the others. Barnes understood that his value to the council was precisely this. He could go places and talk to people that the others couldn't, and he could do it with a sophistication and a credibility that money alone couldn't buy. Jazz Hayden, born Alfonso Hayden and known throughout Harlem as Jazz, was one of the most significant figures in the council's story, and one of the most complex. His territory ran through specific sections of Harlem where his operation had been established for years before the council's founding. He was not simply a drug dealer in the way that term is usually understood. Jazz Hayden was a community figure, someone whose presence in the neighborhood extended far beyond his criminal enterprise, who had relationships with people across every segment of Harlem's social landscape, from the clergy to the politicians to the street organizations. This breadth of relationship was part of what made him valuable to the council. He understood the neighborhood in ways that pure operational intelligence could not provide. He understood the social fabric of Harlem, the pressure points, the relationships, the history of specific blocks and specific buildings and specific families. His brother Joseph was also a council member, which gave the Hayden family a disproportionate weight in the organization's deliberations, though disproportionate is perhaps the wrong word, because their combined contribution to the council's operations was genuinely substantial. Jazz Hayden was also, as would eventually become apparent, a man capable of a life after all of this that none of the other council members quite managed. A post-prison existence of remarkable trajectory that we will come to in full. Guy Fisher was, in many ways, the most tragic figure of all seven. Fisher was born in South Carolina, came to Harlem as a young man, and built his operation with a combination of intelligence and discipline that impressed even Barnes. He was younger than most of the other council members, more polished in certain ways, and more attuned to the legitimate business world that he was simultaneously maintaining as cover and as genuine aspiration. Fisher's business fronts were not merely nominal, they were real operations, real businesses with real employees and real customers, operated with real professional competence. He owned a nightclub, Harlem World, that was one of the most significant venues in the neighborhood, a genuinely important cultural institution that drew performers and audiences from across New York and beyond. He had a genuine talent for business, a genuine interest in legitimate commerce, and a genuine career in that direction that his involvement in the council's heroin operation ultimately foreclosed forever. The specifics of Guy Fisher's eventual fate, the charge, the sentence, the decades that followed, are one of the most devastating threads in this entire story, and we will follow it to its conclusion. But here, at the founding of the council, Fisher represents something important. The possibility that these men could have been something other than what they became, if the world they were born into had offered them a different set of options. Frank James controlled territory in the Bronx, specific sections of that borough where his operation had established deep roots and where his organizational authority was absolute in the way that real street authority tends to be. Not performed, not announced, but simply present and universally acknowledged. James brought something to the council that the Harlem-based members couldn't fully replicate: geographic reach into the Bronx market, which was itself enormous and growing in ways that Harlem alone couldn't capture. The Bronx in the early 1970s was undergoing its own particular catastrophe: the fires, the abandonment, the complete infrastructural collapse that would become famous through photographs and through the infamous quote about the Bronx burning. In that catastrophe was, from the perspective of the drug trade, a market of people with nothing left to lose and plenty of reasons to want to feel something different from what they felt. James understood that market and had built his operation to serve it. His presence in the council meant that the organization's distribution network extended beyond Harlem for the first time, a geographic expansion that multiplied the enterprise's reach and revenue substantially. Joseph Hayden, Jazz's brother, brought his own independent operation and his own territories to the council, and his value was partly additive: more territory, more volume, more distribution infrastructure, and partly relational. Having two brothers in the council created a natural internal alliance that gave the Haydens a certain gravitational weight in the organization's collective decision-making, even within the formally egalitarian structure. Joseph was less publicly prominent than his brother, less present in the community in the way that Jazz was, more focused on the operational aspects of the business, but his contribution to the council's distribution network was real and substantial. His story after the council's fall is one that has been less thoroughly told than some of the others, which is itself a kind of commentary on how these histories get constructed. The people who are less dramatic, less quotable, less cinematically interesting end up occupying smaller spaces in the narrative even when their lives and their fates were equally consequential. Wally Rice was, among the seven, perhaps the one whose personal story has been most thoroughly swallowed by the larger narrative of the council. His specific territories, his specific operational role, his specific relationship with Barnes and the other members, these are documented in court records and DEA files, but they have received less attention from journalists and documentary filmmakers than the more prominent figures. What the records show is a man who was a genuine peer of the others, not a junior partner or a subordinate, but a full member of the council with genuine authority and genuine responsibility for specific aspects of the organization's operations. His relationship with Barnes appears to have been one of genuine mutual respect, built on years of operating in overlapping territories without the destructive competition that characterized many of the other relationships in Harlem's drug world. That history of relative cooperation made him a natural fit for the council's model, and his commitment to the organization's rules and structure appears to have been genuine throughout the period of the council's operation. Thomas Foreman rounds out the seven, and his story, like Joseph Hayden's, has received less attention than it deserves. Foreman's territory, his specific operational contribution to the council, and his eventual legal fate are all documented, but they exist in the shadows of the larger narrative dominated by Barnes and, to a lesser extent, Guy Fisher and Jazz Hayden. This is a common feature of ensemble criminal histories. The organization gets reduced to its most dramatic members, and the others become background figures even when their own stories are complete and consequential in their own right. What can be said about Foreman with confidence, based on court records and investigative reporting from the period, is that he was a genuine member of the council with genuine operational responsibilities, that he was convicted alongside the other members when the organization was prosecuted, and that his fate after conviction deserves to be told as completely as any of the others. 7 men, 7 different backgrounds, 7 different territories, 7 different approaches to the fundamental business of distributing heroin across New York City. And combined in the specific way that Barnes had envisioned and organized, they represented something that had never existed before. Their territories together covered most of the high-density heroin markets in Harlem and the Bronx. Their combined capital gave them access to supply chain relationships that none of them could have established individually. Their combined street organizations, the networks of distributors, lookouts, enforcers, and money handlers that operated beneath the council members themselves, constituted a distribution apparatus of staggering reach and efficiency. And their combined legal defense fund, one of the most remarkable innovations of the council's organizational structure, gave them a collective resilience against prosecution that went far beyond what any individual operator could maintain. By 1976, by the time the DEA's investigation was deepening and the federal government's attention was fully focused on what was happening in Harlem, the council controlled an estimated $100 million a year in heroin distribution. To put that number in contemporary context, adjusted for inflation, that figure represents hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. The revenue of a substantial mid-sized corporation, generated by 7 men operating out of Harlem, built on a product that was destroying the community they lived in and drawing from a supply chain that stretched across continents. The scale of it is almost impossible to fully comprehend. And the sophistication of the organization that generated that revenue, the structure, the rules, the procedures, the discipline, was equally difficult to comprehend for law enforcement officials who had spent their careers dealing with far less sophisticated criminal enterprises. 7 men, Barnes would later say in an interview, reflecting on what they had built. 7 men who decided to stop fighting each other and start building something together. The building. That was what set the council apart from everything that had come before it. Not the violence, not the money, the building, the deliberate, structured, rule-governed construction of something designed to last. Something that was supposed to outlast any individual member's arrest or death or departure. Something institutional. The question of why it didn't last, why it collapsed with a speed and completeness that still astonishes people who study it, is the question at the heart of everything that follows. The founding meeting of the council took place in 1975. The specific location is a matter of some dispute in the historical record. Accounts differ on the exact venue. But what is not in dispute is that the meeting happened, that all 7 men were present, and that what was agreed to at that meeting represented something genuinely unprecedented in the history of black organized crime in America. If you want to understand why the council was different from everything that came before it, and why it was treated by law enforcement, by legal scholars, and by criminologists as a category-defining case, you have to understand not just that they made rules, but what those rules specifically were and what purpose each one served. The first and most significant rule was this: no council member could be killed without a unanimous vote of the full council. Read that sentence again, because it is remarkable. In the world of the street, where disputes over territory and money were routinely resolved through violence, where the murder of a competitor or an associate was simply a tool of business management, the council had decided that within its membership, violence required collective authorization. This single rule had enormous practical implications. It meant that individual council members could not be eliminated by other council members acting unilaterally. It meant that internal disputes, and there were always internal disputes in any organization this size, had to be resolved through the council's deliberative process rather than through violence. It meant, in effect, that the council had created a rule of law within its own membership, a rudimentary but real constraint on the use of force that transformed the nature of internal relationships among the 7 men. The second rule was equally consequential. All major business decisions required collective agreement. Not majority agreement. Collective agreement. Unanimous consent for major decisions meant that no single member could unilaterally commit the organization to a course of action that the others hadn't approved. This was directly borrowed from Barnes's study of the Italian Mob's Commission, the body through which the 5 families coordinated their activities and resolved their disputes. But it went further than the commission in some ways, because the council's unanimous consent requirement was more demanding than the commission's majority rule approach. The implications of this rule were significant. It meant that the benefits of collective decision-making, more information, more perspectives, more buy-in from implementation, were built into the organization's fundamental operating procedure. It also meant that decision-making was slow, which was sometimes a disadvantage and sometimes a protection. The third rule addressed the most dangerous and destructive feature of the pre-council drug landscape in Harlem: territory disputes. The rule was simple and absolute. Territory disputes were to be resolved at the council table, not in the street. Any conflict between council members over territory, customers, distribution routes, or any other operational matter was to be brought to the council for resolution through the agreed-upon process. Violence over territory between council members was prohibited, not merely discouraged, prohibited. The enforcement mechanism for this rule was the collective authority and collective resources of all 7 members, which meant that a council member who resorted to street violence against another member was not just violating a rule, but was taking on the combined opposition of the remaining 6. In practice, this created a powerful deterrent against exactly the kind of destructive internal competition that had previously characterized the Harlem drug trade. The fourth rule concerned what you might call operational independence within collective infrastructure. Each council member maintained his own independent operation, his own street organization, his own customer relationships, his own distribution infrastructure, but shared access to the collective supply chain that the council had established through its combined capital and connections. This is a subtle but important distinction. The council was not a single unified business where all revenue was pooled and distributed equally. It was more like a franchise or a trade association, individual operators maintaining their own businesses, competing in some ways for the same customers, but sharing the infrastructure costs that were most efficiently borne collectively. The shared supply chain meant that all 7 members had access to higher quality heroin at lower prices than any of them could have achieved individually, because the combined purchasing power of the council gave them leverage with suppliers that no individual operator could match. The fifth rule, and this is the one that reveals most clearly how seriously Barnes took the challenge of organizational sustainability, was the creation of a collective legal defense fund. Every council member contributed a specified amount to a shared fund that was available to pay legal fees for any council member who was arrested and prosecuted. This was not charity. It was rational self-interest understood clearly. If one council member was convicted and chose to cooperate with prosecutors, as arrested drug defendants frequently did, the entire organization was at risk. Therefore, ensuring that every council member had the best possible legal representation was not a matter of loyalty alone. It was organizational risk management. The defense fund reduced the probability that any individual member would be convicted and tempted to cooperate, which protected the collective. It was organizational insurance, funded collectively and distributed individually, and it was one of the most sophisticated elements of the council's design. The sixth rule governed personal associations. Council members were required to restrict their close associations to people who had been vetted and approved, or at minimum, to avoid close personal relationships with people who were known law enforcement informants or who were under active investigation. This rule reflected Barnes's understanding of how most criminal organizations were ultimately compromised, not through brilliant investigative work, but through the simple human tendency to be less careful with people you trusted personally than with business associates. Infiltration and informant cultivation typically worked by exploiting exactly this vulnerability, getting close to someone's personal life, their romantic relationships, their friendships, rather than their business operations. Barnes understood this and tried to build protection against it into the council's rules. The seventh rule concerned something that Barnes had learned from watching the Italian mob and from observing the specific vulnerabilities of Harlem's operators more generally. Conspicuous consumption was a liability. The rule against flaunting wealth, against the specific displays of money and status that attracted law enforcement attention and public outrage, was one of the most frequently violated rules of the council, and Barnes himself was its most prominent violator with the New York Times Magazine cover, but it was a rule that reflected genuine strategic intelligence about how criminal organizations get destroyed. The DEA noticed wealth. Prosecutors followed money. The best defense against financial investigation was not having any visible wealth to investigate, or at minimum, having wealth that could be explained through legitimate business activity. Council members were expected to maintain legitimate business fronts, and many of them did, with varying degrees of success and commitment. The actual meetings of the council, the sessions where these rules were applied and decisions were made, were conducted with a level of security consciousness that reflected the members' understanding of exactly how much was at stake. Meeting locations rotated. No meeting was held in the same place twice in succession. The number of people who knew about a meeting in advance was strictly limited. Counter-surveillance measures were employed. Routes to meetings were varied, vehicles were changed. The timing of meetings was unpredictable. The physical structure of meetings, who sat where, who spoke in what order, how votes were conducted, followed a consistent protocol that reduced ambiguity and minimized the opportunity for misunderstanding or later dispute about what had been agreed. The supply chain that the council collectively controlled was the most sophisticated element of their operation, and it is the element that the DEA was most focused on understanding and dismantling. The heroin pipeline ran from overseas sources, Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern suppliers accessed through intermediaries that the council maintained relationships with through Barnes's Lucchese connections, into wholesale distribution operations in New York, and from there into the cutting and packaging operations that prepared the product for retail sale, and from there through the street distribution networks into the hands of individual users. Each stage of this pipeline was managed with a degree of professionalism and attention to quality control that surprised DEA investigators when they began to understand it fully. Barnes had insisted on consistent product quality, a business decision, not a moral one, driven by the straightforward commercial logic that consistent quality built customer loyalty and word-of-mouth recommendation in the same way it did in any other business. The legitimate business fronts that council members maintained were not an afterthought. They were a deliberate and carefully maintained element of the council's operational security. Guy Fisher's Harlem World nightclub was the most prominent of these fronts, but the others had their own record stores, auto dealerships, restaurants, car washes. These businesses served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided a plausible explanation for council members' income and lifestyle. They provided locations where meetings could happen under the cover of legitimate business activity. They provided employment for associates whose presence in the organization needed a legitimate explanation. And in some cases, Guy Fisher's nightclub being the clearest example, they were genuinely successful businesses in their own right, generating real revenue and providing real services to the community. At its peak, in 1976, the picture that emerges from court records and DEA files is almost surreal in its implications. 7 men, operating out of Harlem and the Bronx, had built an enterprise with the organizational sophistication of a mid-sized corporation and the geographic reach of a regional distributor. Their combined territories covered the highest volume drug markets in the city. Their supply chain relationships gave them access to product at prices that undercut any competitor who wasn't operating at their scale. Their legal defense fund had kept every member free of conviction despite multiple arrests and prosecutions. Their rules were being followed. Their meetings were happening. Their votes were being taken. The thing that Barnes had envisioned, a genuine institution, a criminal enterprise with the durability and coherence of an actual organization rather than the fragility of a collection of individuals, appeared to be working. And then Barnes gave an interview to the New York Times magazine. And everything changed. The photograph was deliberate. Every element of it was chosen. The fur coat, floor length, enormous, an unmistakable declaration of wealth in an era and a neighborhood where most people had very little. The tinted glasses, oversized, dark, obscuring the eyes while simultaneously drawing attention to the face. The posture, not aggressive, not threatening, but supremely, almost contemptibly relaxed. The posture of a man who had nothing to fear from the camera or from the people who would see the photograph and understand immediately who and what they were looking at. Nicky Barnes had posed for the cover of the New York Times magazine in January 1977 with the full understanding of what the image would communicate. And the headline the Times ran above the photograph, Mr. Untouchable, was, in his own assessment, simply accurate. The story that accompanied the photograph was detailed, extensively reported, and in certain respects genuinely remarkable as a piece of journalism. The reporter had gotten extraordinary access to Barnes, more access than any journalist had previously been given to an active major drug dealer, and what emerged from that access was a portrait of a man who was both self-aware and astonishingly cavalier about the implications of his self-awareness. Barnes spoke about his operation with a frankness that was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily foolish, depending on how you assessed his confidence in his own invincibility. He spoke about his lifestyle. He spoke about his legal victories. He spoke about the system's inability to touch him in terms that were not quite boastful. He was too sophisticated for simple boasting, but were unmistakably triumphant. He had beaten the system, repeatedly, and he wanted it known. Why did he do it? Why did the man who had built an organization specifically designed to avoid law enforcement attention sit down with the country's most prominent newspaper and say, in effect, "Here I am, come and get me"? The answer requires understanding something about Barnes's psychology that goes beyond simple ego, though ego was certainly present. Barnes had spent his entire life operating in a world where his intelligence and his capabilities were invisible to the legitimate power structure, where the system classified him simply as a criminal, a category that implied a kind of person rather than acknowledging the specific, unusual individual that he actually was. The Times cover was, in a real sense, a demand for recognition. It was Barnes saying, "Look at what I built, look at what I did, look at how thoroughly I outmaneuvered every institution that tried to stop me." The recognition he craved was not from the street. The street already knew who he was. It was from the broader world, from the system he had spent his life defeating. He wanted the system to acknowledge, at least implicitly, that he had won. The other council members' reaction to the cover was not uniformly supportive, and this is an important detail that many accounts of the council gloss over. Several of the other 6 members were furious. The council's own rules specifically prohibited the kind of conspicuous public attention that Barnes had just sought out, not from arrogance, but from the straightforward tactical awareness that high public profiles attracted exactly the kind of law enforcement focus that the organization's security procedures were designed to prevent. Barnes had, in agreeing to the Times interview and photo shoot, violated the spirit of the council's own operating principles, and some of his partners told him so. The friction that the cover created within the council, the first real, documented crack in the unanimity that had characterized the organization's first 2 years, is one of the underappreciated turning points in the entire story. President Jimmy Carter's reaction to the Times cover was immediate, personal, and consequential in ways that Barnes had apparently not fully anticipated. Carter, who had taken office just weeks before the cover ran, looked at the photograph and the headline and the story of a drug lord operating openly in New York City, apparently beyond the reach of every law enforcement agency in the country, and was furious in the specific way that presidents are furious when they see something that makes the federal government look incompetent. Carter designated Barnes, in a White House statement that was widely covered by the national press, as public enemy number 1. This was not a ceremonial designation. It was a practical declaration that the full resources of the federal government were going to be focused on bringing Leroy Nicky Barnes to justice, and that this focus was a personal priority of the President of the United States. The practical implications of Carter's designation were enormous. They translated directly into budget allocations, personnel assignments, interagency coordination, and political accountability at the highest levels of the Justice Department and the DEA. Before the Times cover, Barnes was a high priority for the DEA's New York office. After Carter's statement, he was a national priority with the kind of top-down attention that tends to produce results that individual offices, operating without that level of pressure, rarely achieve. An interagency task force was assembled, combining DEA agents with FBI resources and federal prosecutors from the Southern District of New York, with a specific mandate: develop a prosecutable case against Nicky Barnes and the counsel that could not be defeated by the kinds of legal strategies that had worked so well for Barnes in the past. This mandate led, almost immediately, to a strategic decision that would prove to be the key that unlocked the entire case. Rather than continuing to pursue Barnes individually, the approach that had failed repeatedly, the task force decided to pursue the counsel as a criminal enterprise under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, more commonly known as RICO. RICO, which had been enacted in 1970 and had been gradually refined through prosecutorial practice and court decisions in the years since, was a legal tool specifically designed to address the structural problem that had made organizations like the counsel so resistant to conventional prosecution. Under RICO, prosecutors could charge an entire criminal organization as a single enterprise and hold individual members responsible not just for their own crimes but for the crimes of the organization as a whole. This meant that Barnes, who had been careful to insulate himself from direct involvement in the most prosecutable aspects of the counsel's operations, could be held responsible for those operations under the RICO statute even if prosecutors couldn't prove he had directly participated in specific transactions. It was the legal weapon that changed everything. But RICO alone was not enough. The statute required evidence of a pattern of racketeering activity by the enterprise, and building that evidentiary record required something the task force had been struggling to develop: inside information. Informants. People inside the counsel's organization who knew enough about its operations to provide the kind of specific, detailed, corroborated testimony that would hold up in a federal trial against defense attorneys of the caliber that the counsel's legal defense fund could afford. Finding those informants, persuading them to talk, protecting them once they did, and using their information to build a case that couldn't be torn apart on cross-examination, was the investigative challenge that would consume the next 2 years. The council members themselves were aware that the pressure had intensified. They could feel it in the increased frequency of surveillance, the more sophisticated nature of the DEA's monitoring, the subtle changes in the behavior of people on the periphery of their operations. Barnes's response to this intensified pressure was to tighten the council's security procedures: more rotation of meeting locations, more careful vetting of new associations, more attention to the specific individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment as informants. But the cover had been blown in a fundamental sense that no amount of security procedure could undo. The federal government now had the political will, the resources, and the legal theory to bring down the council. The only question was whether they could find the evidence to make it stick. The investigation that followed Carter's public enemy designation was unlike anything the DEA had previously mounted against a black drug organization. This needs to be stated clearly and without the false modesty that sometimes characterizes official accounts. Previous efforts to prosecute Barnes and the council had failed, and those failures were not accidents. They were the product of a genuine mismatch between the sophistication of the organization being investigated and the investigative tools and strategies being deployed against it. Barnes had studied law enforcement as carefully as he had studied organizational theory. He understood how cases were built, where the vulnerabilities in his operation lay, and how to minimize them. He had exploited every weakness in the prosecution's approach: witness intimidation that was impossible to prove but entirely effective, legal talent that could tear apart circumstantial cases, procedural expertise that turned small evidentiary problems into large ones. The previous failures had taught the task force assembled after 1977 exactly what didn't work. And from that knowledge of failure, they built something different. The specific task force that was assembled, drawn from the DEA, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, was a focused, well-resourced unit with a clear mission and a legal theory that had never been fully applied to a black criminal organization of the council scale. The RICO approach meant that the prosecutors were not trying to build a case against any individual crime or any individual criminal. They were building a case against an enterprise, trying to document the existence of the council as an organization, its rules and structure and membership, and the pattern of criminal activity that it conducted as an organization. This was a fundamentally different evidentiary project than proving that Nicky Barnes had sold heroin on a specific date, and it required fundamentally different investigative techniques. The surveillance operation that the task force mounted was extensive and technologically sophisticated for its era. Wiretaps on phones associated with council members and their associates gave investigators a window into communications that Barnes's security protocols made less comprehensive than it might otherwise have been. The council's practice of rotating meeting locations and varying communication patterns made complete surveillance coverage impossible, but still yielded substantial intelligence about the organization's operations and personnel. Physical surveillance, agents monitoring the movements of council members, documenting meetings and associations, building a map of the organization's physical footprint across Harlem and the Bronx, added another layer of evidence that was harder to challenge in court because it didn't depend on the credibility of any particular informant or witness. But the most significant investigative development, the development that changed the trajectory of the case from ambitious to potentially decisive, was the emergence of informants from within the council's extended organization. Not from the Core Seven, not yet, but from the broader network of distributors, enforcers, and associates who operated beneath the council members themselves. These individuals, lower-level operatives who had first-hand knowledge of specific transactions, specific meetings, specific participants, began to surface as the investigative pressure increased and the prospect of prosecution became more concrete. They came forward for the usual mix of reasons that informants always come forward: fear of their own prosecution, personal grievances against specific council members, deals offered by prosecutors, and the simple human calculation that cooperation offered a better outcome than loyalty. The informant development process was slow and careful, because the council's legal defense fund meant that any informant who was identified before trial would face the full weight of the council's legal resources in an attempt to discredit them. Prosecutors needed not just informants who would talk, but informants who could withstand cross-examination, whose testimony was corroborated by physical evidence, who had no obvious personal motive to lie, who could explain what they knew in terms that a jury would find comprehensible and credible. Building that informant base, protecting those informants, and calibrating their testimony to the overall evidentiary strategy required the kind of patient, methodical work that the DEA had not always been willing or able to do in previous cases against Barnes. The money trail was a parallel investigative thread that proved enormously productive. The council's combined revenue, that estimated $100 million annually, had to go somewhere. It had to be laundered, invested, deployed, concealed. The financial investigation that the task force conducted, working with the IRS and Treasury Department specialists who understood money laundering at a level that pure law enforcement agents typically didn't, began to map the flow of the council's money through legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses, real estate transactions, cash deposits and withdrawals, and financial instruments of various kinds. This financial evidence had a different character than testimonial evidence. It was harder to attribute to personal motive or prosecutorial pressure, and it created a documentary record of the council's existence and operations that was independent of any individual witness's account. The specific breakthrough that tipped the investigation from building a case to ready to move came in the summer of 1977, when the accumulated evidence, the wiretap recordings, the physical surveillance documentation, the informant testimony, and the financial records reached the threshold that the prosecutors had set for bringing charges. The warrant applications were approved. The arrest plans were finalized. And on a specific day in July 1977, the task force executed simultaneous raids across Harlem and the Bronx, hitting multiple locations associated with the council and its extended organization. Barnes was arrested. The other council members were arrested. Lower-level associates were arrested. Evidence was seized, financial records, drugs, weapons, and documentation that corroborated the evidentiary record the task force had assembled over the previous months. The reaction in Harlem to the arrests was complex. The official narrative, that law enforcement had finally caught up with a major drug operation and was bringing it to justice, coexisted with a different narrative in the community that the council had been most deeply embedded in. For many people in Harlem, the council was not simply an abstraction of crime and corruption. It was a presence, an economic institution, a source of income and status, and, in a complicated way, a source of a certain kind of community solidarity. The council members had been, in many cases, locally prominent figures who participated in community life, contributed to community institutions, and occupied a social role that was more multidimensional than the simple drug lord category implied. The arrests disrupted this embedded social reality in ways that created genuine community disruption even apart from the disruption caused by the heroin trade itself. But the legal process was now in motion. The evidence was assembled. The charges were filed. The trial was coming. And for the first time in his career, Nicky Barnes was facing something that all his legal brilliance, all the counsel's defense fund resources, all the procedural expertise he had accumulated over years of beating the system, were not going to be enough to defeat. He was facing a RICO prosecution in federal court with a mountain of evidence assembled by the most focused and resourced investigative effort that had ever been pointed at him. The walls were not just closing. They had already closed. The trial was, in almost every meaningful sense, a formality. The only real question was what the sentences would be. The federal trial of Nicky Barnes and his co-defendants began in 1978 in the Southern District of New York, and from the first day of proceedings, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom, including Barnes himself, that something was different about this case. Previous prosecutions of Barnes had been marked by a certain imbalance. The prosecution had evidence but not enough, or witnesses but compromised ones, or a legal theory but a flawed one. This case had all three in abundance. The evidence was extensive and cross-corroborated. The witnesses were multiple and had been prepared with the kind of prosecutorial care that comes from knowing you're building a historically significant case. And the legal theory, RICO, the organizational conspiracy charge that made the entire counsel's operation prosecutable as a single criminal enterprise, was sound and had been successfully tested in other major prosecutions. The defendant's legal team was excellent, funded by the counsel's legal defense fund and comprising some of the most capable defense attorneys available in New York. And they did everything that capable defense attorneys could do. They challenged the RICO theory on constitutional grounds, arguing that it was being applied in ways that went beyond the statute's intent. They attacked the credibility of witnesses with the thoroughness that had worked in previous cases. They challenged the admissibility of specific pieces of evidence. They raised procedural objections throughout the proceedings. And none of it was enough. The prosecution's case was simply too comprehensive, too well-constructed, and too thoroughly corroborated to be dismantled by any individual line of attack. The evidence that the jury heard over the course of the trial was, in its aggregate, overwhelming. Wiretap recordings placed specific council members in conversations about specific aspects of the organization's operations. Physical surveillance documentation showed meetings that corroborated the testimony of informants about the council's structure and decision-making processes. Financial records showed money flows that were inconsistent with the legitimate business income of any of the defendants and consistent with the revenues of a major drug distribution operation. The testimony of cooperating witnesses, individuals who had been inside the council's extended operation and had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for consideration at sentencing, provided the human narrative that made the documentary and surveillance evidence comprehensible to a jury. Barnes's own defense strategy in this trial was notably different from his strategy in previous cases. He was no longer simply challenging individual pieces of evidence or trying to create reasonable doubt on specific charges. He was engaging, through his attorneys, with the broader RICO theory, trying to convince the jury that whatever the individual defendants had done, the counsel as described by the prosecution simply didn't exist as a formal criminal enterprise in the way the RICO statute required. This was, perhaps, the most sophisticated defense available to him. And it was not entirely implausible. The council's organizational structure, while genuinely sophisticated by the standards of street-level criminal organizations, was not as formally documented as, say, the Italian Mob's Commission. The rules existed, but they hadn't been written down in a charter. The votes were taken, but there were no minutes. The defense argued that what prosecutors were calling a criminal enterprise was really just a loose association of independent operators who occasionally did business with each other. The jury did not find this argument convincing. The verdict came in on January 19, 1978. Guilty on all counts. Every defendant, the entire council as charged, was found to have existed and to have operated as a criminal enterprise exactly as the prosecution had argued. The conviction was total and unambiguous. Not a partial victory with acquittals on some counts, not a hung jury on key charges, but a complete prosecution success across the board. The sentencing, conducted by Judge Henry Werker, was designed to match the scale of the crime. Barnes received the maximum available sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 44 years old. Judge Werker was not merely mechanical in pronouncing this sentence. He was, by all accounts, deliberate and emphatic, making clear from the bench that the sentence was intended to communicate something beyond the individual case, that it was a statement about what the criminal justice system was willing to do to address the level of harm that the council's operation had inflicted on an entire community. The specific words Werker used in his sentencing statement have been quoted and requoted in subsequent legal and journalistic accounts of the case, and they reflect a judicial awareness of the historical significance of what was being decided in that courtroom. Barnes's reaction in the courtroom in the moment after his sentence was pronounced has been described differently by different witnesses. What the accounts agree on is that he received the sentence with a composure that struck observers as either extraordinary self-control or a kind of blankness, the face of a man who had processed what was happening but had not yet decided what to do with the processing. Life without parole. He was going to die in federal prison. Everything he had built was gone. Every rule he had made, every meeting he had run, every supply chain he had managed, every dollar he had accumulated. All of it was now being dismantled by law enforcement and the courts, and he was going to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, inaccessible to the world he had dominated for a decade. The other council members received sentences ranging from lengthy prison terms to, in some cases, life sentences of their own. The council as a functioning enterprise ceased to exist in that courtroom on that day. Its territories were vacant. The supply chain was disrupted. Its financial resources were frozen and seized. The organization that Nicky Barnes had spent years designing and building and refining, the thing that was supposed to be institutional, supposed to outlast individual members, supposed to be durable in a way that previous criminal enterprises had not been, was gone. In the end, it had lasted approximately 2 years as a functioning entity before the DEA's investigation reached the level required to bring charges. 2 years. The most sophisticated black criminal organization in American history had lasted 2 years. But the story did not end with the verdict. In fact, in the most important ways, the story was only beginning. Because what happened in the years after the verdict, what Barnes discovered inside prison, what he decided to do about it, and the chain of consequences that decision set in motion, is the part that most accounts of the council never fully tell. And it is, in every sense, the most consequential part. The federal penitentiary that received Leroy Nicky Barnes in 1978 was not prepared for him in the sense that no institution is prepared for someone whose reputation precedes them as completely as Barnes's did. He was, by any measure, one of the most famous inmates in the federal prison system at the time of his arrival. The cover of the New York Times Magazine had seen to that, as had the extensive press coverage of his trial and conviction. His status inside was consequently complex from the beginning. There was the respect that comes from genuine fear. Other inmates knew who Barnes was and treated him accordingly. There was the curiosity that attaches to someone whose legend has traveled ahead of them. And there was, from certain quarters, the hostility that high-profile prisoners attract from people who resent the attention or who have their own interests in testing the boundaries of an incoming inmate's actual toughness versus their reputation. Barnes navigated all of this with the same strategic intelligence he had brought to everything else. He was not reckless inside. He was not trying to build a prison operation or extend his influence in the way that some high-profile inmates do. He was, by the accounts of people who observed him in his early years of incarceration, a man who had decided to think, to read, to study, to understand exactly what had happened to him and why, with a clarity that the pace and pressure of his pre-prison life had never allowed. He read widely law, history, biography, social theory. He had access to the legal records of his own case and those of his co-defendants and spent considerable time understanding the evidentiary structure that had brought him down, the specific vulnerabilities in the council's organization that the prosecution had exploited. He was not wallowing. He was analyzing. What sustained him in those early years of incarceration, and what gave him a connection to the outside world that most long-term prisoners lose gradually, was his belief that the people closest to him on the outside were maintaining some version of the world he had left behind. His wife, his counsel partners who had received shorter sentences and were either out on appeal or approaching release. The money that had been accumulated before the arrests. Not all of it had been seized, because not all of it was traceable, and Barnes had been sophisticated enough in his financial practices to conceal at least some portion of his assets. He believed, in the early years, that these things were being maintained, that the people who owed him loyalty were being loyal, that the world he would eventually return to, even if that return was years away and dependent on appeals that might or might not succeed, was being held together by the people he trusted most. He was wrong, and the process of discovering how wrong he was, the specific pieces of information that reached him inside prison, the specific betrayals that became apparent one at a time over a period of months and years, constitutes one of the most devastating human stories in this entire account. Because Barnes was not wrong in some vague, general way. He was wrong in specific, personal, documented, deeply humiliating ways. The money he thought was being preserved was being spent by people who had decided that his life sentence meant he was never coming back and that the money was therefore available for their own use. The businesses he thought were being maintained were being allowed to collapse. And his wife, the woman whose loyalty he had taken as absolute, was involved with one of his council partners, with a man who had sat at the same table as Barnes, who had voted on the same decisions, who had sworn to the same rules, who was one of the seven. The specific identity of the council member involved, the man who was, as Barnes would later describe it in multiple interviews, sleeping with his wife while Barnes was serving a life sentence that his membership in the council had helped produce, is documented in Barnes's own memoir and in subsequent reporting on the case. The betrayal was personal and organizational simultaneously. It was not merely infidelity. It was infidelity by someone who had benefited directly from Barnes's organizational genius, had sat at his table, had voted with his votes, and had then taken advantage of Barnes's incarceration to take the one thing that Barnes clearly valued above the money and the territory and the street reputation. It was, in Barnes's own framing, the ultimate violation of everything the council was supposed to represent. How Barnes found out is less clearly documented than what he found out. Prison communication systems in the late 1970s and early 1980s were less sophisticated than they would later become, and the information that reached Barnes came through the combination of prison visitors, contraband correspondence, and the informal intelligence networks that long-term prisoners develop with remarkable sophistication. What is clear from Barnes's own later accounts is that the information came in pieces, not as a single devastating revelation but as an accumulating body of evidence that added up, over time, to a picture he could no longer deny or rationalize. The final piece of that picture, whatever specific information confirmed what he had been slowly understanding, was the thing he later described as his breaking point. The moment when the loyalty that had been the foundational principle of everything he had built, everything he had believed about the people closest to him, revealed itself as something that existed only so long as it was convenient. His psychological response to this revelation was not immediate action. He could not take immediate action. He was in federal prison, serving life without parole with no obvious path to the outside. What he could do was think. And think he did with the same methodical, analytical intelligence he had brought to every other problem in his life. He had built something. It had been betrayed. By the people who owed him the most. By the people who had the most to lose from any exposure of what the council had been and how it had operated. Those people, his former partners, the people who knew everything, had made a calculation about what his life sentence meant, and they had decided it meant they were free. Free from loyalty. Free from the rules of the council. Free from Nicky Barnes. He had a different calculation to make. And the calculation he made would change everything. In 1983, Leroy Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, the man who had built the most sophisticated black criminal organization in American history, the man who had beaten the system repeatedly and publicly and defiantly, the man whose very identity was built around loyalty and organizational discipline and the code of silence that distinguished serious criminals from rats, approached federal prosecutors and told them he wanted to cooperate. The words almost don't parse. The sentence almost doesn't make sense. Nicky Barnes wanted to cooperate with the government. The man who had, through his organizational genius, helped keep an entire enterprise free from prosecution for years. The man who had, through the council's legal defense fund, ensured that his partners had the best possible legal representation when the prosecution finally came. That man was now sitting across a table from federal prosecutors and offering them everything he knew. The specific trigger for Barnes's approach to prosecutors was what he had learned about his wife and his counsel partner. But it is important, genuinely important, not to reduce what happened to a simple story of a jealous man getting revenge. Because what Barnes offered prosecutors went far beyond what a revenge-motivated informant would have needed to provide. He didn't just give them information about the specific partner who had betrayed him. He gave them everything. The full scope of his cooperation, when it was eventually revealed through the prosecutions that followed, was staggering in its comprehensiveness and in its implications for everyone who had ever been associated with the council. The negotiations between Barnes and prosecutors were careful on both sides. Barnes understood his leverage. He was not simply a peripheral witness with limited knowledge. He was the architect of the entire enterprise. He knew things that no one else knew at the same level of detail and specificity. He knew the supply chain relationships. He knew the financial structures. He knew the specific crimes that had been committed by specific individuals at specific times. He knew about corruption, about law enforcement officials whose relationships with the council had extended beyond the conventional adversarial boundary. He knew about the council's connections to the Italian mob and specifically to the Lucchese family. The scope of what he knew was, in the prosecutor's assessment, extraordinary, and he was willing to share all of it. In exchange for something specific, a reduction in his sentence. Not freedom, not immediately, but relief from the life without parole designation that meant he was going to die in prison regardless of what he did or didn't do in the years that followed. The government's response to Barnes's approach was, understandably, one of both excitement and caution. The excitement was obvious. Barnes, as a cooperating witness, was potentially the most significant informant in the history of federal drug prosecution. The caution was equally understandable. Barnes was a sophisticated, manipulative individual with every possible personal motive to lie, to shade the truth, to use his cooperation as a tool against specific enemies rather than as a genuine effort to provide accurate information. Prosecutors needed his testimony to be reliable, corroborated, and usable in court. Securing that required extensive debriefing sessions, hours and hours of questioning in which Barnes was walked through everything he knew. His accounts were cross-checked against the physical evidence and financial records the government already possessed, and his testimony was tested for internal consistency and corroboration against independent sources. What Barnes gave them in those debriefing sessions was comprehensive. He provided detailed testimony about the council's structure and operations that went beyond what investigators had assembled through their own surveillance and informant development. He provided information about specific transactions, specific meetings, specific decisions that the council had made collectively. He named individuals, inside the council's organization and outside it, whose involvement in specific criminal acts had previously been unknown or unprovable. He provided information about corrupt law enforcement officials whose relationships with the council had shielded it from some forms of investigation. He named names at the supply chain level, the wholesale and import intermediaries whose connections to the council had allowed it to maintain the heroin pipeline that was the foundation of everything. He did not hold back. He gave them everything. The prosecutions that followed Barnes's cooperation were extensive and devastating in their scope. Former council members and associates who had believed themselves safe, who had calculated that the government's case was closed with the original convictions and that the remaining organizational knowledge would die with Barnes in prison, found themselves facing new charges based on evidence and testimony they had not anticipated. The trials were multiple and they were largely successful. Barnes's testimony, combined with the physical and financial evidence that corroborated it, proved persuasive to jury after jury. People who had thought they were untouchable discovered they were not. And the reach of the cooperation extended well beyond the council itself, into the supply chain, into the Italian mob's connections to the drug trade, into the corruption networks that had provided the council with partial protection. Guy Fisher's case is the one that deserves the most sustained attention, both because of Fisher's significance within the council's history and because of the devastating trajectory of his legal fate. Fisher, who had been convicted in the original council prosecution and was serving his sentence, faced additional charges based in significant part on Barnes's cooperation. The evidence that Barnes provided about Fisher's role in the council's operations was extensive and specific, and it contributed to legal proceedings against Fisher that resulted in what is, in the full context of his story, one of the most severe outcomes of the entire council prosecution. Fisher received a life sentence, a sentence that meant, as it meant for Barnes initially, that he would die in prison. The specific details of Fisher's post-conviction legal efforts, the appeals he filed, the years he spent fighting his conviction, and the ultimate outcome of those efforts constitute a thread in this story that we will follow to its conclusion in the next section. The street reaction to the news that Barnes was cooperating, when that news eventually became public, as it inevitably did, was something that no analysis of the legal proceedings can fully capture. Nicky Barnes was not just a drug lord to Harlem. He was a legend. He was, in the specific psychological economy of the community, a symbol of something, of black capability, of resistance to a system that had excluded and oppressed, of the particular kind of triumph that comes from a man who was supposed to have nothing building something enormous in the face of everything arrayed against him. The revelation that this man had become a government informant, that Mr. Untouchable had cooperated with the same federal government he had spent his entire life defeating, landed with the force of a profound disillusionment. People who had revered him felt betrayed. The death threats that reached Barnes inside prison after news of his cooperation spread were numerous and serious enough to alter the security arrangements around him significantly. But what had Barnes actually done? He had done what the people he trusted most had done to him first, calculated his own interest over his loyalty to others. The difference was that his calculation was visible to the entire world, while theirs had been conducted in private. He had, in a way that the street code would never forgive, done the thing that the street code existed precisely to prevent. And he had done it with the same thoroughness and effectiveness that he had brought to everything else in his life. If Nicky Barnes was going to be an informant, he was going to be the best informant the federal government had ever had. That was, in a strange and uncomfortable way, entirely consistent with who he had always been. His sentence was eventually reduced. The cooperation that he provided, the prosecutions it enabled, the supply chain information it revealed, the corrupt officials it exposed, was valued by the government at a level that justified a significant sentence reduction. Barnes was ultimately released from prison. The man who had been sentenced to die behind bars walked out of a federal penitentiary and disappeared into the witness protection program, assuming a new identity that the government has never disclosed and that remains, to this day, unknown to the public. The most famous drug lord in New York City became, by design, a ghost. And the streets of Harlem, where his legend had been built over a decade of extraordinary criminal achievement, continued without him, changed permanently, as we will see, in ways that had nothing to do with his departure and everything to do with what his enterprise had done to them. 7 men built the council. 7 men were destroyed by it. But destroyed is too simple a word for what actually happened to each of them, because their stories after conviction diverge in ways that are as individual and as human as the men themselves. Following each of them to their conclusion, not as a list, not as a tally of sentences and release dates, but as individual human stories, is the only way to do justice to the full scope of what the council's collapse actually meant. Guy Fisher's story is the one that contains the most sustained tragedy of any of the 7, and it requires being told in full. Fisher was convicted in the original council prosecution and sentenced to what amounted to a very long prison term. Barnes's subsequent cooperation provided additional evidentiary basis for further legal proceedings that contributed to Fisher ultimately facing a life sentence. But Guy Fisher did not simply accept that fate and disappear into the prison system. He fought it, for decades, through appeals and legal challenges that continued far longer than most people are willing to sustain the effort of fighting the legal system. His case attracted attention not just from legal advocates but from a broader community of people who followed the council's history and who believed, for various reasons, that Fisher's sentence was disproportionate or that his legal proceedings had been compromised by the specific circumstances of Barnes's cooperation. The broader tragedy of Guy Fisher's case lies in what Fisher himself represented before his involvement in the council's heroin operation foreclosed every other possibility for him. He was a man of genuine business intelligence and organizational capability, attributes demonstrated not just by his criminal operation but by Harlem World, the nightclub he ran during the council's years that was a genuinely important cultural institution. Harlem World was not a front in any meaningful sense. It was a real cultural venue that hosted real performers and served real community functions, a place where Harlem's creative and cultural life had a home during a period when such spaces were increasingly rare. That Fisher possessed the ability to build and manage something like Harlem World, something that served the community rather than exploiting it, while simultaneously operating within the council's heroin trade, is one of the clearest illustrations of the broader tragedy that runs through this entire story. These were men with capabilities that the legitimate world had decided were not available for legitimate deployment. Jazz Hayden's story after conviction is one of the most remarkable personal transformations in this entire account, and it is a story that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Jazz Hayden served his prison sentence and emerged from it as a different kind of presence in the world. He became, in his post-prison life, a community activist and advocate, a man who used the specific knowledge and relationships that his criminal career had given him to work in the spaces where the street economy and the legitimate economy intersected, helping people navigate between those worlds and find paths that did not lead to the same places had led. His relationships with prominent political and community figures in New York, relationships that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew only the council-era Jazz Hayden, are documented in subsequent journalism and in his own public interviews, which he gave with a candor and self-awareness that is genuinely striking. He spoke about what he had done, what it had cost, and what he was trying to do with whatever time remained. Jazz Hayden died in circumstances that have been reported in community journalism but have not received the national attention that his council-era prominence might have suggested. His death, like his post-prison life, remains underreported relative to his actual significance. Frank James served his sentence for the council's crimes and lived a life after prison that has been less publicly documented than Jazz Hayden's. What the public record shows is that James navigated the post-prison world with the kind of low-profile existence that stands in stark contrast to the public prominence of the council years. A deliberate invisibility that may have been chosen or may simply have been the product of circumstances that removed him from public attention. His story, like Joseph Hayden's and Wally Rice's and Thomas Foreman's, represents one of the historical gaps in the council's narrative. Individuals whose lives and fates are part of the complete story but whose post-conviction trajectories have not been followed with the same journalistic attention as Barnes and Guy Fisher and Jazz Hayden. Joseph Hayden, Jazz's brother, the council's second Hayden member, served his sentence and navigated his post-prison life in a way that has been even less publicly documented than Frank James's. The historical record on Joseph Hayden after conviction is thin in ways that reflect a broader problem with how these histories get constructed. The people who are less cinematically dramatic, less quotable, less available to journalists and documentary filmmakers end up occupying smaller spaces in the narrative even when their lives were equally shaped by the events being described. What can be said with confidence is that Joseph Hayden's involvement in the council, his contribution to its operations, his conviction alongside his brother and the other members, and his subsequent incarceration, was a complete and real chapter in a life that deserves to be understood as more than a footnote to his brother's more prominent story. Wally Rice served his sentence and, like several of the other less prominent council members, lived a post-prison life that has not been extensively documented in journalism or historical accounts. The gap between the prominence of the council years, when Rice was a peer of Barnes and Fisher and the Haydens, when his voice and vote mattered in the organization's deliberations, and the subsequent obscurity of his post-conviction story is one of the more striking features of the council's historical record. It reflects the way that criminal histories tend to focus on the dramatic and the exceptional rather than on the full human scope of the events being described. Thomas Foreman is perhaps the most thoroughly obscured of all 7 council members in the existing historical record. His conviction, his sentence, his time in prison, and his post-prison life have received the least journalistic attention of any of the 7. A circumstance that is not a reflection of his relative importance to the council's actual operations but rather of the specific dynamics of how these histories get told, which tend to concentrate narrative attention on the most prominent, the most dramatic, and the most recently accessible individuals. Nicky Barnes himself, the man at the center of everything, lived in witness protection through the 1980s and 1990s under an assumed name in an undisclosed location, paid a government stipend and provided with a new identity in exchange for his cooperation in a series of prosecutions that stretched across nearly a decade. What his life looked like during those years, what he did, who he knew, how he experienced the radical discontinuity between the Harlem drug lord who had been on the cover of the New York Times Magazine and the anonymous government witness living somewhere in America under a false name, is largely unknown, because the witness protection program is precisely designed to make it unknown. He surfaced publicly in 2007, when he participated in a documentary film called Mr. Untouchable, the same phrase from the Times cover, now reclaimed as a title for the story of his downfall. In that documentary, Barnes was visible on camera for the first time in decades, speaking about the council, about his cooperation, about the betrayals that had preceded it, and about his own accounting of what his life had meant. He also published a memoir, Mr. Untouchable, in the same period, a first-person account that is rich in detail and self-justification, and that requires reading with careful attention to the ways in which his account both illuminates and obscures specific aspects of the story. Barnes chose what to say and what not to say, as any memoir writer does, and the gaps in his account are as instructive as the content. His current status, as of the time the script is being written, is believed to be alive, somewhere in America, under an assumed identity that has never been publicly revealed. The most famous drug lord in New York City is, if the government's assessment is correct, still out there. Still living under the protection that his cooperation earned him. Still, presumably, carrying the full weight of everything that built and everything he destroyed and everyone whose lives were changed forever by his choices. Leroy Nicky Barnes is a ghost, but the world he left behind is real. And what that world looked like, what the council's decade of operation actually cost the people it was built on top of, is the part of this story that is the hardest to tell and the most important. Everything that has been told in this video up to this point has been told, primarily, from the perspective of the 7 men who built the council. Their intelligence, their organization, their discipline, their downfall, their fates. And that telling is accurate. It is the factual record, documented in court records and DEA files and journalism and memoir. But it is incomplete in a way that every account of the council that focuses primarily on Barnes and the 6 is incomplete. Because the story of the council is not, finally, the story of 7 men. It is the story of what those 7 men's enterprise did to an entire community. It is the story of the heroin, the addiction, the overdoses, the children left parentless, the parents left childless, the families broken, the neighborhoods hollowed, the generation that came of age in Harlem and the Bronx during the council's years and lived with the consequences of those years for the rest of their lives. The heroin that the council distributed was not an abstraction. It entered the bodies of real people. It created chemical dependencies that overrode every other human priority: parental love, professional ambition, personal integrity, physical self-preservation. The specific figures for heroin addiction and overdose mortality in Harlem and the Bronx during the period of the council's operation are documented in public health records, hospital reports, and municipal statistics from the era, and they are devastating in their scale. Overdose deaths in New York City in the 1970s, a period that tracks almost exactly with the rise of the independent black drug trade and the establishment of the council, reached levels that would not be seen again until the opioid epidemic of the 21st century. The specific neighborhoods that were hardest hit were the neighborhoods that the council served: Harlem, the South Bronx, the specific blocks and buildings where the distribution networks were most dense. What those numbers represent in human terms, in the terms of individual lives and individual families, can only be partially conveyed through statistics. The mother who lost her child to a heroin overdose in a stairwell. The father who watched his family dissolve as his addiction consumed everything he had built. The child who grew up in a household defined by addiction, by the chaos and the neglect and the specific poverty of a family where resources are continuously diverted to the purchase of heroin. The teenager who grew up in a neighborhood where the most visible path to income and status ran through the very distribution networks that were destroying their families. These are not hypothetical people. They are documented in the social service records and the hospital records and the journalism of the period, in the accounts of community organizations that were trying to respond to the addiction crisis with resources that were never remotely adequate to the scale of the problem. The specific named individuals whose lives were destroyed by the heroin that the council distributed are harder to locate in the historical record than the organizational details of the council itself, and that asymmetry is itself a moral statement about the stories we choose to tell and the people we choose to remember. The 7 men who ran the operation are named and documented. The people who were destroyed by the operation are, in most accounts, anonymous, reduced to statistics or to brief humanizing anecdotes that cannot bear the full weight of what actually happened to them. Part of the work of telling this story honestly is insisting on that asymmetry even when we can't fully correct it. The generational damage from the council's heroin operation extended well beyond the direct victims of addiction and overdose. It shaped the community in structural ways that persisted for decades after the council itself was gone. Children who grew up without parents, because one or both parents had died or been imprisoned as a direct or indirect result of the heroin trade, carried the psychological and economic consequences of that childhood into adulthood and passed some of those consequences to their own children. Neighborhoods where the drug trade had been the primary economic institution for years experienced the specific devastation of having that institution, however destructive it was, suddenly removed without any legitimate economic alternative appearing to replace it. The social infrastructure that had been eroded by years of addiction and violence and economic extraction took decades to begin rebuilding, and in many cases never recovered to the level that existed before. The public health response to the heroin crisis in Harlem and the Bronx during the council's years was, by any measure, wholly inadequate. The city's healthcare system was already under severe fiscal stress, New York City's near bankruptcy in 1975, and the subsequent austerity measures had cut social services and public health resources at precisely the moment when those resources were most desperately needed. The federal government's response was primarily punitive rather than therapeutic. The drug war framework that would be formalized under Reagan but was already being established under Nixon and Carter prioritized prosecution and imprisonment over treatment and community support. The communities most affected by the heroin epidemic were left to manage its consequences with the least possible external support, which meant that most of those consequences were managed not at all. Former addicts who have spoken on record about this period, in oral history projects, in documentary films, in journalism, describe a Harlem that was simultaneously vibrant and devastated, a neighborhood where cultural richness and community resilience coexisted with the daily reality of addiction and death in ways that created a specific, painful kind of cognitive dissonance for everyone who lived through it. They described the specific experience of watching people they loved disappear into heroin, not all at once but gradually, in a way that felt almost like watching someone drown in slow motion, able to see the process clearly but unable to stop it. They described the specific experience of living in a neighborhood where the most successful and prosperous people around them were the people involved in the drug trade, where the economic lessons being taught every day by visible example were lessons about the specific paths to income that the drug trade made available. Why do we know the names of the 7 men and not the names of their victims? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine historical question with a specific and uncomfortable answer. We know the names of the 7 men because the legal system documented them, indicted them, tried them, convicted them, sentenced them. The legal system was built to process the perpetrators of crime, and it documented them with the thoroughness that legal proceedings require. The victims of the crime, the people whose addiction and death and family destruction were the actual substance of the harm that the council caused, were not processed by the legal system in the same way. They appeared, at most, as data points in public health statistics or as unnamed individuals in social service case files. The stories that got told were the stories that the available documentation supported, and the documentation was better for the men who ran the operation than for the people who suffered from it. What it says about America that this is so, that the most carefully preserved records of this period of devastation in Harlem and the Bronx are the records of the people who caused the devastation, while the records of the people who experienced it are fragmentary and incomplete, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. It says something about whose lives the documentary apparatus of American society was designed to track and preserve, and whose lives it treated as background. It says something about what kinds of stories get told and funded and published and distributed. And it says something about the specific way that the glamorization of criminal achievement and the simultaneous erasure of criminal harm are not separate phenomena but two sides of the same cultural coin. The story of the council has been told in various forms in various media for decades, and almost every one of those tellings has gotten something substantially wrong, omitted something substantially important, or shaped the narrative in ways that serve the mythology rather than the history. Understanding those distortions is not a side project in the larger story of the council. It is part of the story itself because the way that the council's story has been told has shaped what people believe about the council, and what people believe about the council has consequences for how they understand the history of Harlem and the history of the heroin epidemic and the history of Black America in the 1970s. The 2007 film American Gangster, which starred Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as the detective pursuing him, was primarily about Lucas rather than the council. But it placed the council and Nicky Barnes within its narrative and in doing so gave many viewers their first, and often only, understanding of what the council was. The film's portrayal of Barnes, played by Cuba Gooding Jr. with a flamboyance that the film uses to contrast with Lucas's calculated restraint, is so simplified and so distorted by the film's narrative needs that it functions more as a caricature than as a portrait. Barnes in the film is essentially a foil for Lucas, a symbol of excess and recklessness against which Lucas's supposed discipline and professionalism can be measured. The actual Barnes, the organizational genius who built a structure that the Italian mob found impressive enough to take seriously, the man who studied criminal enterprise with the rigor of an academic, is not visible in that portrayal. More significantly, The film's rendering of the relationship between Lucas and Barnes, and between their respective organizations, takes significant liberties with the historical record. The specific timeline of events, the specific nature of the organizational competition between them, and the specific historical sequence of their respective rises and falls are all adjusted in ways that serve the film's dramatic purposes, rather than the historical record. This matters not because Hollywood films are expected to be documentaries, they aren't, and no reasonable person expects them to be, but because for a subject like this one, where the mainstream documentation is already thin and the mythology is already thick, a major Hollywood film with major stars becomes one of the primary sources through which most people understand the history. When the film gets the history wrong, the wrong version spreads, and the accurate version becomes harder to find. The 2007 documentary Mr. Untouchable, the film that Barnes himself participated in, presents a different but equally complicated problem of reliability. Barnes participated in the documentary as a storyteller in full control of his own narrative, with decades of distance from the events being described and a lifetime of practice at constructing a version of himself that served his interests. The documentary is rich in detail and atmosphere, and gives viewers access to Barnes's own voice and personality in a way that no other source does. But it is also, necessarily and by design, Nicky Barnes's version of Nicky Barnes's story. The council members and associates who might have offered corrective or competing accounts were either still in prison, living under their own imposed obscurity, dead, or simply unwilling to participate in a project that Barnes was driving. The documentary's account of the council's betrayal, specifically the account of what his partners and his wife did while he was in prison, is told entirely from Barnes's perspective and with Barnes's framing, which means it needs to be read with awareness of what it is. One man's account of a situation in which he had enormous personal and narrative investment. Barnes's memoir, Mr. Untouchable, is similarly valuable and similarly limited by the same constraints. He was a gifted narrator with a genuine talent for self-presentation, and the memoir reads compellingly as a first-person account. But the specific claims it makes about the council's structure, about the betrayals that preceded his cooperation, about his motivations and his decision-making, are claims made by a man with every incentive to construct the most favorable possible version of his own choices and every opportunity, given his control over what he chose to include and exclude, to do exactly that. Reading the memoir against the court records and the investigative reporting of the period reveals specific points of divergence that are instructive about what Barnes chose to emphasize and what he chose to minimize. The rap references and street mythology that have accumulated around Barnes and the council since the 1980s represent a third layer of mythologization that is distinct from both the Hollywood version and Barnes's own self-presentation. In hip-hop culture specifically, and in the broader street mythology that hip-hop both reflects and creates, Barnes became an icon of a specific kind of masculine achievement, a symbol of the extraordinary that had been built from nothing in the face of everything. The specific details of the council's actual history, the rules, the democratic structure, the collective decision-making, the legal defense fund, the organizational sophistication, are almost entirely absent from this mythologized version. What remains is the image. The fur coat, the glasses, the cover of the Times, the word untouchable. The mythology serves cultural purposes that are real and important, but it does so by stripping away exactly the parts of the story that are most historically significant and most useful for understanding what actually happened. The victims of the council's heroin operation are, in virtually every cultural account of the council, the film, the documentary, the memoir, the rap references, the street mythology, either absent or present only as the most nominal and cursory acknowledgement. The $100 million a year in revenue that the council generated was not generated in the abstract. It was extracted from the bodies of addicted people in some of the most economically devastated neighborhoods in America. The glamour of the 7 men at the table is inseparable from the devastation of the people who funded that table. Every account that glamorizes without reckoning with that inseparability is incomplete in a way that has real consequences for how we understand history, for how we evaluate the figures being glamorized, and for how we think about the communities that lived through the reality those accounts sanitize. The reliable historical record of the council, the court records, the DEA investigative files, the journalism of the period, the academic criminological work that was produced in the aftermath of the prosecution, is not glamorous. It is detailed and procedural and full of specificity that resists the reduction to legend. But it is far more interesting, when engaged with fully and honestly, than the legend. Because what the real record reveals is not a simpler story than the myth but a more complex one. A story about intelligent people making choices that destroyed themselves and others, about an organization that was genuinely sophisticated in some ways and fatally flawed in others, about betrayal and loyalty and ego and institutional failure at every level of American society. That is the story worth telling. That is the story that this video has tried to tell. The counsel of Nicky Barnes did not simply end. It echoed. It reverberated through the legal system, through the drug policy landscape, through the specific streets of Harlem and the Bronx, and through the broader historical understanding of what organized crime in America could look like when it was built by people who had previously been excluded from the kinds of organizational power that the Italian mob had taken for granted. Understanding those echoes, the specific changes that the Council's existence and fall produced in the world, is the final piece of the historical account. The most immediate and most significant legal legacy of the Council's prosecution was the RICO precedent it helped establish. The United States versus Barnes prosecution was not the first RICO case. The statute had been used in earlier prosecutions, but it was one of the most significant early applications of RICO to a black criminal organization at this scale, and the legal theory that the prosecutors developed and successfully argued became a template that federal prosecutors across the country used in subsequent cases. The specific approach, building a case against an organizational enterprise rather than against individual crimes, using the structure and rules of the organization itself as evidence of the criminal conspiracy, holding leadership responsible for the pattern of the enterprise's crimes rather than requiring proof of their direct participation in specific transactions, became the standard approach for prosecuting major drug organizations from the 1980s onward. In a very real sense, every major RICO prosecution of a drug organization that has happened in the decades since the Council's fall stands on the legal foundation that the Barnes prosecution helped lay. The DEA's institutional response to the Council's prosecution was equally significant. The specific investigative techniques that were developed to bring down the Council, the interagency coordination, the sustained informant cultivation, the financial investigation, the comprehensive surveillance approach, became model practices that were documented, analyzed, and disseminated within the law enforcement community. The Council had, in effect, forced the DEA to develop better investigative methods by being sophisticated enough that conventional methods were insufficient. There is a grim irony in this. Barnes's organizational genius, which was intended to protect the Council from prosecution, ultimately forced law enforcement to develop tools and techniques that made all subsequent drug organizations more vulnerable. The Council's fall made it easier to prosecute everyone who came after. What happened to Harlem after the Council fell is a question with a deeply uncomfortable answer. The answer is not that things got better. The answer is that things changed in ways that were in some respects different from what the Council had produced and in other respects equally or more devastating. The vacuum that the Council's prosecution left in the Harlem drug market did not remain a vacuum for long. Other operators moved in. New organizations formed. The specific structure and discipline of the Council was not replicated. Nothing like the Council's organizational sophistication appeared again in Harlem, but the drug trade itself continued, because the social conditions that had made it so profitable were still exactly what they had been. Poverty, unemployment, inadequate public services, the absence of legitimate economic opportunity at the scale the community needed. None of those things were addressed by the Council's prosecution. The prosecution addressed the supply side of the drug trade without addressing any of the demand-side conditions that made the supply profitable. And then, with a historical timing that feels almost too cruel to be coincidental, the crack cocaine epidemic arrived. In the early to mid-1980s, just as the Council's prosecution was concluding, just as the heroin trade's major organizational infrastructure had been dismantled, crack cocaine began flooding the same neighborhoods that the Council had served. Crack was, in almost every way that mattered for the drug trade, the heroin of the next generation. Cheaper, faster-acting, more immediately addictive, easier to distribute at retail scale, and requiring less organizational sophistication to sell than the heroin trade had required. The dismantling of the Council had not prepared Harlem or the Bronx for crack cocaine. In some ways, it may have left those neighborhoods more vulnerable to it. The organizational infrastructure that Barnes had built, whatever its horrifying human cost, had also provided a kind of local economic order that crack's fragmented, decentralized, violently competitive distribution model immediately destroyed. The crack epidemic of the 1980s hit the same communities that the Council's heroin operation had devastated, and it did so with a speed and completeness that made the heroin era look, in some retrospective assessments, almost organized by comparison. The violence that the council's rules had been explicitly designed to minimize, the territorial disputes, the retaliatory killings, the gang warfare over corners and blocks, exploded during the crack era with an intensity that dwarfed anything that had characterized the council years. The murder rate in New York City, which had been extremely high during the 1970s, climbed to even more catastrophic levels in the late 1980s and early 1990s as crack competition produced exactly the kind of uncontrolled violence that the council structure had been intended to prevent within its membership. What did the council prove about black organizational capability? This is a question that criminologists and historians have engaged with carefully, and the answers are complicated by the fact that the capability being demonstrated was deployed in the service of something that caused enormous human harm. The council demonstrated, conclusively, that the organizational sophistication and institutional discipline that had been assumed to be the exclusive province of Italian organized crime were not, in fact, exclusive to anything. Given the right individual, given someone with Barnes's specific combination of intelligence, ambition, organizational vision, and freedom from conventional moral constraint, and given the specific historical moment that created both the market opportunity and the supply chain conditions, black criminal entrepreneurs could build something of extraordinary organizational sophistication. This was not a proud discovery, but it was a real one. The scholarly and criminological study of the council, conducted in law enforcement training programs, in academic criminology departments, and in legal scholarship, has focused primarily on the organizational and legal dimensions of the case. What made the council's structure innovative? How the RICO prosecution worked? What investigative methods were developed in response to the council's security protocols? What the council's legal defense fund represented as an organizational innovation. These are legitimate and important analytical questions, but the criminological analysis has been less thorough in addressing the sociological question that the council's existence poses most sharply. What does it mean that the most sophisticated organization some of these men could build, with these capabilities and this intelligence, was built around heroin and the destruction of their own community? The one-sentence verdict on what the council actually was, after all the organizational analysis and all the legal history and all the human cost accounting, is something like this. It was the product of a society that consistently excluded its most capable citizens from legitimate paths to achievement, told them through every institution and every policy that their intelligence and ambition had no legitimate claim on success, and then expressed horror when those citizens turned their intelligence and ambition toward the only markets that were genuinely open to them. This is not an excuse for what the council did. It is an explanation for how it came to exist. And the distinction between excuse and explanation matters enormously, because the explanation points toward things that could be different, toward the specific policy choices and institutional arrangements that produce the conditions in which organizations like the council become possible, while the absence of explanation allows those conditions to continue unchanged, which they did, which is why the crack epidemic followed the heroin epidemic in the same neighborhoods with the same communities suffering the consequences. We started with a photograph, a man in a fur coat, oversized tinted glasses, the specific, deliberate posture of absolute confidence in his own invincibility, a headline that said, Mr. Untouchable, and we asked what had brought that man to that photograph, what had built the organization that made him possible, what had destroyed it, and what it had cost. Now you know. You know about 7 men who sat at one table and wrote rules for an enterprise that had never existed before in the history of American crime. You know about the specific organizational innovations, the unanimous vote requirement for member killings, the collective legal defense fund, the territory dispute resolution procedure, that made the council something genuinely different from everything that had come before it. You know about the magazine cover that was simultaneously Barnes's greatest triumph and the beginning of his end. You know about the federal investigation that used RICO for one of its most significant early applications. You know about the trial and the life sentences and the federal penitentiary. And you know about the betrayal, the specific, personal, documented betrayal that turned the architect of the most sophisticated black criminal organization in American history into the federal government's most consequential drug war informant. But here is what I want you to sit with. The council had rules against murder without a vote. Rules against reckless personal behavior. Rules against conspicuous wealth display. Rules against unauthorized business decisions. In some technical and deeply uncomfortable sense, the council was more internally rule-governed, more procedurally disciplined, and more collectively accountable in its operations than many of the legitimate institutions that surrounded it. The police departments that had corruption problems, the financial institutions that were laundering money, the political institutions that were making policy decisions about these neighborhoods while knowing as little as possible about the actual conditions in those neighborhoods. The council, a criminal enterprise built on heroin, had better internal governance in certain specific ways than some of the institutions that were supposed to be governing the communities it was destroying. What does that say? I am not asking rhetorically. I am asking genuinely. What does it say about the opportunities that were available to men like Nicky Barnes and Guy Fisher and Jazz Hayden? What does it say about the specific combination of capability and exclusion that produced the council? That the most sophisticated institution some of the most intelligent and organizationally capable men in Harlem could build was built around heroin? What does it say about America that this is what those capabilities were deployed toward? What does it say about what we choose to celebrate and what we choose to forget? That we know the names of the 7 men and not the names of the thousands of people whose lives were destroyed by what those 7 men built. Tell me what you think in the comments. I mean that, not as a YouTube formality, as a genuine question, because this story does not have clean answers. It has a clean timeline and documented facts and court records and verified journalism. But the moral accounting of what the council was and what it meant is not something that any single account, including this one, can complete. It requires everyone who hears it to do their own accounting. This video is part 2 of a series. Part 1, the full, deeply researched story of Frank Lucas, the man who built his own empire in Harlem through his direct connection to the Southeast Asian heroin supply during the Vietnam War, is on this channel right now. If you watched that video and came here because you wanted the next chapter of this world, you already know what this channel delivers. If this is your first video here, go back and watch that one. The 2 stories together, Lucas's individual empire and the council's collective enterprise, are the complete picture of what was happening in Harlem in the 1970s, and they illuminate each other in ways that neither story does alone. And the final ask: if this video told you something that the films didn't tell you, that the documentary didn't tell you, that the legend never bothered to include, if you learned something tonight that changed how you understand what happened in those streets in those years, you know what to do. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who thinks they already know this story. Subscribe if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one. 7 men. 1 table. 1 set of rules. It lasted 2 years. The heroin lasted a generation. And the questions it raises have not been answered yet.